If you wrote General Studies Paper 2 in Mains 2026, the first thing to understand is this. This was not primarily a paper of difficult topics, it was a paper of difficult decisions. Most of the broad subjects were familiar, like speaker, election commission, tribal development, civil services, governor, federalism, education, BRICS, and BRI. But UPSC repeatedly did something different with those subjects. It placed a proposition inside the question, it inserted a qualifying word, it divided one familiar topic into two or three separately markable demands. And then it is asked you to make a judgment. That is why two candidates who had revised almost the same material could have written completely different quality papers. So, in this analysis, I'm not going to simply tell you question 1 came from this topic, question 2 came from this topic. That is not paper analysis. For all 20 questions, we are going to ask four things. What exactly was UPSC asking? Where was the trap? How should a serious answer have been constructed? And what separated an ordinary answer from a high quality one? Only after we finish that will I come to our own preparation and tell you question by question where our material helped, where it only partially helped, and where we had a genuine gap. That order matters because first we have to understand UPSC, only then do we have the right to make claims about ourselves. So we are moving to the chapter number 1, that is the shape of GS2 2026. So 20 questions, 250 words, 250 marks. First 10 questions, 150 words, and remaining 10 questions, 250 words, that is 15 marker. So question number 1 to 10, 10 marks each, 150 words. Question number 11 to 20, 15 marks each, 250 words. The outer structure is familiar, but the internal design is not. The biggest characteristic of this paper is that UPSC repeatedly moved away from tell me about X, like tell me about this, to towards here is a claim about X. Test it. Test it. So look at the language. Has the speaker's office become vulnerable? Do constitutional commission possess adequate enforcement powers? Does tribal policy reflect socially grounded and equity based governance? Does IPMDA really bridge the gap? How far has Indian federalism succeeded? To what extent do pressure groups deepen democracy? Can rights based welfare actually be realized under certain conditions? Should education be treated primarily in one way or another? Has BRI transformed South Asia into a theater of great power competition? So, those are not retrieval questions. Those are not retrieval questions. They are judgment questions. And that gives us the first major finding of GS2 2026 paper. So knowledge was necessary, but knowledge by itself was not sufficient for this paper. So UPSC increasingly used familiar syllabus areas as vehicles for testing judgment. Here there is a second feature. Several questions contain more than one independently markable demand. So look at question number 3. asks for diagnosis and institutional reform. And question number 4 contains three separate issues in 150 words. Question number 5 asks first whether powers are adequate and then asks for reform. Then question number 11 contains three constitutional problems. Question number 13 contains assessment, explanation and reform. Then question number 15 contains two large democratic propositions. Question number 20 asks for implications for both security and regional influence as far as BRI is concerned. So this paper was also testing whether you could budget words before writing. And there is a third feature. The paper was not simply a static versus current affairs. That is binary. That binary is too crude. The real pattern was static plus contemporary, static architecture plus contemporary trigger. Look at the transgender question. The transgender act question required constitutional rights plus a 2026 amendment. The electoral roll question required constitutional or statutory understanding plus a May 2026 Supreme Court judgment. The governor question required Articles 200 and 201, but also knowledge of the latest constitutional position. So the live event mattered only because it changed, tested, or activated an underlying institution. That distinction will matter enormously for 2027. Now let us go through every question. Let's take chapter number 2, that is questions 1 to 10, the 150 word paper, 10 marks each. Every word had to earn its place. So the question number 1 we are taking, that is transgender identity, privacy, and the 2026 amendment. So look at that question. The question says that privacy relating to self identity is protected under Article 21 and asks you to examine the effect of the 2026 amendment to the Transgender Persons Act 2019. The weak reading here is write everything I know about transgender rights. That would produce NALSA Article 14, Article 15, Article 21, the 2019 Act, welfare schemes, and probably miss the question. In the UPSC question mains, what we have to do is understand the demand of the question and you have to write for that demand only in answer. The actual examination is much narrower. UPSC has already supplied the constitutional lens, privacy plus self identity plus article number 21. Your job is to take the amendment and test its effect against the lens. So the 2019 Act expressly contained a right to self perceived gender. The 2019 Act expressly contained a right to self perceived gender identity. The 2026 amendment omitted section 4 clause 2. India code regards that omission as effective from 25th May 2026. So the answer needed a clear structure. The first line is going to be the amendment strengthens or alters the statutory recognition framework, but the removal of an express self identification guarantee raises a serious constitutional tension with the decisional autonomy, dignity, and identity under Article 21. Then what changed? Then why does self identification matter constitutionally? Then what legitimate state interest might be offered in favor of verification or certification. Then, does the mechanism satisfy proportionality? That last move is important. That is, a high quality answer would not simply say amendment bad because nalsa. It would test the state action continuous constitutionally legitimate, objective, then sustainability, then necessity, then proportionality, and then safeguards. The differentiator, therefore, was not the number of transgender schemes you knew. It was whether you recognized that the UPSC was asking for a rights versus regulatory state constitutional examination, rights versus regulatory state constitutional examination. So you have to understand the question first, then only you have to write an answer for that particular question, that to the point, because the word limit is here, that is 150 words only. So the second one, that is women's reservation. Why constitutional amendment? Why constitutional amendment? So UPSC gives you a proposition. UPSC gives you a proposition. Women as a class are neither a minority group nor traditionally treated as a backward class. Women as a class are neither a minority group nor traditionally treated as a backward class. Then it asks you to discuss the evaluation of women's reservation from local bodies to parliament. So the obvious answer is chronology. The 73rd Amendment, 74th Amendment, reservation in panchayats and municipalities, then 106th Constitutional Amendment. But chronology alone is not enough. Why did UPSC give you that opening quotation? Because it is asking about the constitutional route by which cross-cutting social category came to receive political reservation. Women are present across caste, class, religion, language, and region. Therefore, this is different from a simple vertical category. A strong answer would be establish that conceptual point first. Then trace the evolution. Local democratic representation created a constitutional laboratory. Then Articles 243D and 243T institutionalized reservation at the grassroots. Then states in many cases expand beyond the constitutional minimum. Then the move to parliament and state assemblies through the 106th Amendment represents the extension of the same logic to higher legislatures, although implementation is linked to census and delimitation. So the high quality answer would then add one analytical sentence. What is that analytical sentence? Representation is not identical to empowerment, and representation is not equal to empowerment. That allows you to mention proxy representation, party nomination structures, intersectionally, intersectionality, rotation, capacity, and the importance of institutional conditions surrounding the quota. So the weak answer tells the story. The strong answer explains the constitutional logic behind the story. Behind the story. So this is regarding the women's reservation question. And then we are moving to question number 3, that is speaker anti-defection and partisan vulnerability. In these two questions, question number 1 and question number 2, we discuss in our marathon series, that is GS2 marathon series. We discuss in our social justice marathon under the GS2 complete marathon revision. And then the question number 3, that is we are going to discuss, that is relating to speaker and anti-defection and partisan vulnerability. This is a beautiful example of how UPSC converted a familiar topic into a judgment question. It does not ask to discuss the role of speaker, Like traditional questions, it asks whether the constitutional office of the Lok Sabha Speaker has become vulnerable to partisan politics under the current anti-defection regime, and then asks what institutional changes are required to ensure neutrality in a polarized house. So there are two demands here: diagnosis and reform. And the word whether means you need a verdict. A weak answer begins by describing how the speaker is elected and lists the powers. So here, this is not necessary here. A stronger opening would be the office is constitutionally designed for neutrality, but the combination of partisan election, continued party affiliation, and adjudicatory power under the 10th schedule or 10th schedule creates a structural vulnerability to partisan incentives. So now you have answered the question, then explain the mechanism. The speaker decides disqualification petitions. Timing itself can alter legislative majorities. Judicial review also exists, but usually comes after institutional damage may already have occurred. You have to quote cases such as Kyoto Holohan and the latter anti-defection jurisprudence provide the constitutional anchors. Then comes to reform, that is time-bound disposal. Time-bound disposal, independent or tribunal-based adjudication, removal of disqualification adjudication from the speaker, convention of resignation from party position, protection of tenure, narrower whip application to confidence and core financial matters. The differentiator here is casual reasoning. Do not merely write speaker should be neutral, explain why the present institutional design creates vulnerability. This is the heart of the question. Explain why the present institutional design creates vulnerability, and this is heart of the question. This we discussed speaker and anti-defection case we discussed in our GS 2 marathon, that is polity and constitutional section. Then we are moving to question number 4, that is right to vote and citizenship. Right to vote, electoral roles and citizenship. This may be the most dangerous 150-word question in the paper. UPSC asks, is the right to vote a fundamental right? Discuss the election commission's position while revising electoral rolls. Can it also examine citizenship? 3 demands, 10 marks, 150 words. 150 words. So the first demand is the trap. Because it is easiest one, a candidate could easily spend half the answer discussing whether voting is fundamental, statutory, or constitutional, and leave almost nothing for the contemporary UPSC is actually testing. The Supreme Court's 27th May 2026 judgment in Association for Democratic Reforms versus Election Commission of India upheld in the BR special intensive revision and held that the Election Commission may conduct a limited inquiry into citizenship for electoral roll eligibility, while final citizenship adjudication remains with the competent authority under citizenship law. That distinction is the answers center. So I would structure it in approximately 3 blocks. The block number 1 is status of voting right, constitutionality, statutory framework, not an unrestricted fundamental right to vote, simpliciter, very short. Then comes to block 2, that is electoral roll revision under article 324, under representation of the people act architecture, inclusion and electoral integrity, procedural fairness. Under this particular two acts, one constitutional and other one is representation of people act 1951 and 50. Son, block 3 then citizenship, Election Commission of India can scrutinize citizenship for the limited purpose of electoral eligibility, but it cannot final adjudicate a person's citizenship for all illegal purposes. So this is the separator. A weak candidate might write a weak answer should be like this: ECI, that is Election Commission of India, cannot examine citizenship. Another weak answer should like this: Election Commission of India can decide citizenship. The high quality answer says limited electoral inquiry, not to final citizenship adjudication. And notice something else here: this question rewarded word allocation as much as legal knowledge, because here 3 blocks, that to 150 words. So look at the answering the questions asked in UPSC. Rather than knowledge, not only knowledge, they are asking for word limit also for writing an good answer. Then moving to next question, that is NCSC and NCST, power versus effectiveness. This right to vote and citizenship question we discussed in our marathon exclusively for SIR, and what is the role of SIR for Election Commission of India under Article 324, we discussed in our marathon. Then comes to NCSC, NCST. The question asks whether constitutional bodies such as NCSC and NCST possesses adequate enforcement powers to secure substantive social equality, and then asks for measure to increase institutional effectiveness. What is the key word here is adequate. Adequate. You are not being asked to describe articles number 338 and 338A. You are being asked to assess whether the constitutional design is strong enough to achieve the intended outcome. That requires a distinction: investigative or process powers versus binding remedial power. The commissions exactly we discussed in our marathon exclusively regarding investigating powers and recommendatory powers and binding powers. The commission can investigate, summon, examine, report and advise, but recommendations do not operate like executable judicial orders. That creates a gap between constitutional status and enforcement outcome. So a good thesis could be their constitutional status gives them visibility, access, and investigative authority, but their predominantly recommendatory design. This we stressed in our marathon series under the social justice and power, polity and constitution topic. So predominantly recommendatory design limits their capacity to convert findings into enforceable equality outcomes. So comes to the reforms: mandatory government response, time bound action taken reports, stronger monitoring, data and research capacity, follow up powers, better coordination with states, adequate staffing, parliamentary scrutiny of non compliance. The weak answer lists powers. The strong answer asks, do these powers actually change outcomes? That is substantive equality. So we discuss fully about question number 4. We discussed earlier, that is right to vote, electoral roles and citizenship. Is the right to vote fundamental? Discuss ECA's position on role revision. Can it examine citizenship? Three demands. Here the trap we discussed, the differentiator we discussed. This is major anchor we discussed as far as ADR versus ECI. So then move to question number 6, that is tribal development, equity or administrative paternalism. Does India's tribal development policy reflect the aspirations for a socially grounded and equity based governance? Justify your answer. So here two phrases control the whole answer: socially grounded and equity based. So you need the criteria. Socially grounded means what? Institutions must recognize tribal social organization, community rights, cultural autonomy, and local decision making. Then comes to equity based. Equity based means not merely equal schemes, but responsive adapted to historical disadvantage and distinctive conditions. So the answer should test policy against those criteria, against those criteria. On one side, fifth and sixth schedule, PESA, Forest Rights Act, trial subplan logic, then community forest rights, specially targeted development programs. One side, on the other, implementation deficits, land alienation, displacement, weak Gram Sabha control, administrative override, forest right recognition gaps, and development projects imposed without meaningful participation. So the ideal verdict is neither yes completely nor no nothing works. Is something like India's constitutional and statutory architecture increasingly recognize equity and a community agency, but implementation frequently remains administratively driven rather than socially grounded. That is a proper UPSC judgment. This is regarding tribal development. We discussed in our marathon GS to complete division marathon. We discuss about these PESA Act, tribal development, fifth and sixth schedule, etc. Then comes to question number 7. Malnutrition. Malnutrition is not a health question. Malnutrition is not a health question. UPSC itself gives the candidate the required expansion. So malnutrition is not merely a public health concern. It is also about social equity, human development, and welfare governance discuss. The weak answer writes causes of malnutrition, then effects, then government schemes, etc. That is not the correct answer. But the proposition tells you how to organize the answer. You need 4 lenses. The first one is health, disease burden, mental health, child growth, equity, gender, caste, tribal status, geography, income, access. Then comes to human development, learning outcomes, productivity, cognitive development, integrate intergenerational transmission. Then comes to governance, delivery convergence, sanitation, drinking water, food security, ICDS, health systems, and local implementation. The strongest answers would show that these are not 4 separate boxes. They form a chain, like poor sanitation causes infection. Infection reduces nutrient absorption. Maternal deprivation affects birth outcomes. Household gender relations affect food distribution. Weak welfare convergence means food availability does not necessarily become nutrition security. So question rewards system thinking, like chain thinking, rather than simply listing the numbers. So 4 lenses in one chain. That is first sanitation, then absorption, then nutrition security. Then comes to generalist civil services. Analyze the advantages and limitations of the generalist structure of the Indian civil services in contemporary governance. This is one of the few comparatively straightforward prompts, but even here, contemporary governance is the qualifier. The answer should not become an essay on the IAS. Advantages: what? Whole of government perspective, field experience, coordination, adaptability, political administrative interface, institutional memory, crisis management. The limitations: technical complexity, short tenures, domain discontinuity, risk aversion, generalist domain dominance over specialist systems, weak professionalization, weak professionalization. The high quality conclusion rejects the false binary. India does not need generalists or specialists. It needs a generalist for coordination, specialist for depth, plus generalist for coordination, plus specialist for depth, plus institutional mechanisms that allow the two to work together. That means lateral entry where useful domain postings, longer tenures, professional tracks, and evidence based decision support. The differentiator is refusing the binary. So this is also we discussed in our civil services, democracy in civil services, as in the GS2 marathon governance topic. In this we discuss lateral entry, civil services limitations, etc. We discussed in our governance marathon. These marathon GS2 completely available in our Metis IAS Academy YouTube channel. You can go through it. And then comes to question number 9, IPMDA and the Quad. Does it really bridge Sagar and the Quad? This is an excellent IR question. This also we discussed in our GS2 complete revision marathon, exclusively international relations. The statement says that IPMDA bridges the gap between India's Sagar vision and the Quad's collective Indo-Pacific strategy. Then UPSC asked for a critical assessment focusing on IPMDA. Then comes to weak answer defines Sagar, describes the Quad, and then explains IPMDA. That is 3 mini notes. That is not correct. The strong answer tests on verb bridges. Here they asked bridges here question, and enabling architecture, not enforcement. How? Sagar emphasis security, growth, capacity, and regional partnership. The Quad adds wider collective strategic architecture. The IPMDA provides maritime domain awareness through data tracking and information sharing. Therefore, it converts an abstract convergence of visions into a practical public good capability. So, but then comes the critical part here, information is not enforcement. Information here is not enforcement. Data is not deterrence. Maritime awareness does not automatically produce Coast Guard capacity. Maritime awareness does not automatically produce Coast Guard capacity. So there are sovereignty, access, technology, interoperability, and implementation issues. So the strongest wording is something. Verdict is something like this: IPMDA is a functional bridge between India's inclusive maritime vision and the Quad's regional capacity building agenda, but it remains an enabling architecture rather than an enforcement mechanism. This should be in your answer. That one sentence answers the whole question. So then comes to the question number 10, that is BRICS, counterweight versus alternative. UPSC says BRICS acts as your powerful counterweight in global governance and amplifies the global south, then asks how BRICS projects itself as an alternative to other groupings. These are two ideas here that should not be collapsed. The first one is counterweight, the second one is alternative. A counterweight can constrain or rebalance an existing order without replacing it. An alternative requires parallel institutions, mechanisms, or norms. So the answer should test BRICS at two levels. The first one is counterweight. Counterweight, expanded membership, global south representation, reform of multilateral institutions, greater bargaining power, agenda setting as alternative architecture, new development bank, contingent reserve arrangement, local currency discussions, south-south cooperation mechanisms. But comes to limits matter, heterogeneous strategic interests, consensus structure, institutional thinness compared with older blocks, and comes to China and India tensions, different relationships with the West. So the high quality answer says BRICS is already a meaningful balancing platform, but its transformation into a coherent systematic alternative remains incomplete. Again, degree judgment, not celebration, not dismissal. So this is the variation you have to use in your answers. So then moving to the chapter number 3, that is question number 11 to question number 20, that is 250 word paper. This is 15 marks each, more room and more demands hidden in the system. So the first question, that is 11th question, that is governor, three questions disguised as one. This is one of the most technically demanding questions in this paper. We discussed this in detail in our governance marathon due to its importance. So this is one of the most technically demanding questions in the paper. UPSC asks, discuss the position of governor in Indian federalism. This is expecting question also. What is the nature of the governor's power while assenting to the state bill? Is the governor bound by aid and advice in the function in all functions? The question is what? Position of the governor in federalism. Nature of assent power on a state bill. Bound by aid and advice in all functions. So here three demands. The first danger is writing 180 words on the governor generally and reaching assent with no space. The answer needed deliberate allocation. The part one is what? Federal position. Governor as constitutional head of the state, but also an institutional interface between union and state. That dual position creates a recurring federal tensions. That's it. Then comes to part two, the article 200 options and article 201 where a bill is reserved. And here is the and here the date of your law mattered enormously, because the Supreme Court's November 2025 presidential reference held that courts cannot impose constitutionally absent timelines for articles 200 or 201, rejected the concept of deemed assent under article 142, and stated that the governor's or president's constitutional role cannot simply be substituted by another authority. So anyone producing an outdated mid 2025 note without updating the law risked writing the wrong operative position. So next come to the part 3, aid and advice. General rule. Governor ordinarily functions on ministerial aid and advice. The particular state government, council of ministers, aid and advice. But the constitution recognizes limited areas of discretion also. The important thing is to resist saying governor is always bound or governor is free to decide. Both are wrong. The correct answer is what? The correct answer is constitutional specificity. Constitutional specificity. The wider lesson from question 11 is enormous. In constitutional current affairs, revision is not enough. The candidate must know which legal position is still operative on the day of the examination. So that is the way you have to write an answer for this question. Then comes to 12th question, that is judicial legislation through passive euthanasia. What is meant by judicial legislation? In this context, discuss the Supreme Court verdicts allowing passive euthanasia and a living will. The temptation is to write an essay on euthanasia, but UPSC has given you the lens. Judicial legislation. So, first define the phenomenon carefully. Court interrupt law. Court interrupt law. But where a rights problem exists and legislation is absent or inadequate, judicial guidelines may temporarily structure the field. This is the simple thing, judicial legislation you have to understand. But where court judicial legislation means what? Courts interpret law. So the first define the phenomenon carefully. That is what? Courts interpret law. Then comes to, but where a rights problem exists and legislation is absent or inadequate, Judicial guidelines may temporarily structure the field. That is the definition. Then use the euthanasia line of cases as evidence. Aruna Shanbag, common case, common cause, then living wills or advanced directives, then Article 21, dignity, autonomy, safeguards against abuse. So the high quality answer then addresses the constitutional tension. Judicial innovation may protect fundamental rights in a legislative vacuum, but prolonged judicial rule making also raises separation of powers and institutional competence concerns. That final tension is what transform a case summary answer into GS2 answer. So use passive euthanasia cases as evidence for the lens. So name of the SOP tension, that is separation of powers tension. Then moving to question number 13, that is federalism versus federalism and asymmetry, like federalism, diversity, asymmetry, and disputes. How far has Indian federalism been successful in accommodating regional and cultural diversities? Highlight asymmetric federalism and suggest measures to make dispute resolution mechanisms more effective. The question has three separate jobs. The first one is evaluate success, then explain the role of asymmetry, then reform dispute resolution, and how far requires a degree. So, a possible thesis: Indian federalism has been substantially successful in converting diversity into negotiated constitutional accommodation, but recurring fiscal, territorial, linguistic, and institutional disputes show that accommodation remains uneven. Then demonstrate success, like linguistic reorganization, special constitutional arrangements, sixth schedule, Article 371A to 371J, autonomous councils, political decentralization. Then explain why asymmetry matters. A federation dealing with unequal historical, cultural, and geographic conditions cannot always use identical arrangements. Asymmetry can therefore be a tool of unity, not a violation of unity. So then comes to limitations. First one, interstate water disputes. This is recurring, unending. Interstate water disputes. Then fiscal conflict, then governor controversies, centrally sponsored scheme tensions, boundary disputes, weak interstate council use. Then comes to reforms: strengthen intergovernmental forums, regularize consultation, improve tribunal design, time bound dispute processes, greater fiscal predictability, institutionalize negotiation before litigation. The weak answer defends cooperative federalism. The strong answer shows what how constitutional flexibility has held diversity together. So the federalism and asymmetry, all these things, like articles 371J to 371A, etc., we discussed in our polity and constitutional parts as far as GS2 complete revision marathon is concerned. Then comes to 14th question: India and USA compare and access, not country blocks. UPSC asks how separation of powers operates in India compared to the rigid presidential model of United States, and then asks you to compare the actual authority of the Indian Prime Minister with the US President. The most common weak structure would be half page India and half page USA. That creates a description, not comparison. The better structure is by axis, that is executive legislative relationship. India is fusion, USA is what? Institutional separation. Then comes to tenure: Indian executive depends on legislative confidence, US president has fixed tenure. Then cabinet: India collective responsibility. Comes to US water, presidential appointments and separate legislature. Then comes to legislative influence: Indian PM with a stable majority may exercise extraordinary agenda control, US president must negotiate with Congress. Comes to judicial review and checks: both systems contain strong constitutional checks but through different institutional designs. Then comes to the sophisticated part. Formal separation does not automatically tell us where political power lies. A prime minister commanding a disciplined parliamentary majority can, in practice, dominate the legislative agenda more strongly than a US president facing divided government. That is probably what UPSC wanted through the face actual authority. So compare a constitutional design and political reality. So here compare access by access, separate design from political reality. This is regarding India versus USA. Then moving to 15 question number, that is pluralism versus corporate capture. This is one of the richest questions in the paper. To what extent do pressure groups, social movements, and corporate lobbies deepen pluralist democracy by representing exclude interests? Analyze whether the growing convergence of cooperate wealth and political power poses a threat to the autonomy of formal democratic institutions. Here, two propositions. The first one is, do organized interests deepen democracy? The second one is, when does organized influence become institutional capture? The weak answer lumps NGO movements, business associations, and lobby groups together, but strong answer distinguish them. Pressure groups can aggregate interests, social movements can introduce excluded voices. Farmers, women, environmental groups, disability groups, tribal organizations, and civil society networks can broaden representation beyond election. So that supports pluralism. But corporate lobbying raises another issue, which resources are highly unequal. Money can shape access, agenda setting, campaign finances, media ecosystems, policy expertise, then regulatory design. The central conceptual distinction is influence is normal in democracy, capture is not. So the answer should therefore ask whether political access remains contestable and transparent. So the reforms could include lobbying transparency, political finance disclosure, conflict of interest regulation, strong independent regulators, parliamentary scrutiny, and a competitive media and civic space. The best verdict here is what organized interests deepen democracy when they widen representation, they weaken it when unequal resources convert access into capture. We discussed this in our governance GS2 complete marathon regarding pressure groups, etc. Then we are moving to next question, that is transparency about trust, not only corruption. UPSC says transparency and accountability are not merely about controlling corruption, they are about creating stakeholder trust through rule of law and participatory governance. Comment. So this is the question. The question itself tells you about the you to broaden the conventional anti-corruption frame. Transparency has least three functions: integrity, it deters arbitrary and corrupt action; legitimacy, people understand why decisions were taken; participation, citizens can meaningfully engage only when information is available; accountability then converts information into answerability and consequence; rule of law gives predictability; participation gives voice. Together they build trust. A strong answer would also introduce limits, like transparency cannot mean publication of everything, like privacy, national security, commercial confidentiality, decision making space, data protection. These require calibrated exemptions. So mature transparency is not maximal disclosure, it is principled disclosure under law with the accountable exemptions. That is a higher order answer. So in this way you have to write an answer. This is also we discussed in governance topic in our marathon. Then moving to question number 17, that is rights with capacity. Rights without state capacity. Can the constitutional mandate of rights based welfare be effectively realized in the context of non integrated governance and minimal public investment? Examined. The answer to cannot be evasive. Strong opening should be like this: not effectively. Constitutional recognition creates entitlement, but rights become substantive only when fiscal capacity, administrative integration, and delivery institutions exist. Simple. Then explain the constitutional side, like directive principles act, article 21 expansion, education, food, health related entitlement, social security architecture, then explain implementation. Then comes to rights based welfare requires finance, personal data systems, center state local coordination, grievance redress, last mile delivery, institutional accountability. If departments operate in silos, a multidimensional deprivation cannot be solved. A malnourished child may require nutrition, sanitation, healthcare, maternal support, and income security simultaneously. So, non integrated governance is not administrative jargon here. So, it is itself a cause of rights failure. The high quality answer, therefore, links like this: rights, then capacity, then convergence, then outcomes. So, you have to take a position first that entitlement is substantive only with delivery capacity. So this is also we discussed in our rights based discussion. Then comes to 18th question, education. Education, the word primarily. Should education be treated primarily as a welfare obligation of the state or as a strategic investment for building a global competitive knowledge driven nation? Critically evaluate. This question looks easy because everyone has material. That is precisely why it is dangerous. The deciding what is primarily. If your conclusion is only both are important, you have avoided the question. First, establish the welfare case. Education is right. Education has right, equally opportunity, social mobility, citizenship. Then comes to reduction of intergenerational disadvantages. Then the strategic investment case, human capital, research, innovation. Then comes to AI and technology, productivity, demographic dividend, global competitiveness. Then comes to evaluate the binary, both. The best synthesis is not 50-50, it is hierarchical. So something like education must remain a universal welfare obligation at the foundation level, because exclusion itself destroys equality. On that universal base, higher education, skilling, and research must increasingly be treated as strategic national investment. So now you have actually answered primarily. That is what a high quality UPSC answer does. It does not escape a difficult choice by saying everything matters. So comes to the education question. Build a hierarchy. What you have to do is then universal welfare base, then strategic investment on top, because first of all it is needed. Then going to the top, that is convert into strategic investment for the future, like tertiary education, etc. Then moving to 19th question, that is diaspora as living bridge. Diaspora as a living bridge, UPSC gives you an ambitious proposition. India's global diaspora is living bridge, an economic factor, and a knowledge network that transforms cultural heritage into geopolitical influence and strategic leverage. Critically examined. The weak answer lists remittances, CEOs, and festivals abroad, etc. The strong answer takes part apart the chain, like diaspora, then economic capital, under that remittances, investment, entrepreneurship, then diaspora, knowledge capital, technology networks, universities, innovation ecosystems, professional connections, then diaspora, cultural capital, language, cuisine, cinema, festival, civilizational connections. Then ask, what does cultural presence become geopolitical leverage? Through political participation, business networks, elite access, public diplomacy, policy advocacy, people to people relationships. But comes to critical exam and requires limits. Diaspora are not agents of the Indian state. Their interests can diverge. Host country politics matters. Identity politics can generate tensions. Consular vulnerabilities exist. Overestimating diaspora influence can itself produce strategic error. So a strong conclusion says like this: the diaspora expands India's relational power, but its value lies more in networks and influence than in direct geopolitical control. That distinctions matter. So this is also we discuss in our IR marathon. Then comes to the final question, that is BRI and South Asia. BRI, that is Belt Road Initiative, and the geopolitics of South Asia. The final question says China's BRI has transformed South Asia from a regional space into a theater of great power competition, and asks for implications for India's security and regional influence. Again, do not write a country tour like Pakistan, CPEC, Sri Lanka, Hamman, Tota, Nepal projects, Maldives projects, Bangladesh projects. That is information. UPSC wants a structure. Start with proposition. Why does infrastructure create geopolitics? Because infrastructure changes connectivity, debit relationships, port taxes, standards, supply chains, allied incentives, strategic presence, and long term dependence. So then divide implications into two buckets. First one, India's security, CPEC and sovereignty concerns, dual use infrastructure, maritime access, Chinese strategic presence, surveillance and logistic implications, pressure across continental and maritime theaters, then India's regional influence, competitive financing, neighborhood perceptions, connectivity alternatives, development partnerships, diplomatic bargaining. If India simply opposes BRI, that is insufficient. The answer needs the competitive alternative also, like credible financing, faster project implementation, BBIN, like BIMSTEC, connectivity, maritime partnerships, transparent infrastructure, local ownership, neighborhood first economic integration. So the best conclusion like this: BRI has converted infrastructure into strategic statecraft. India's answer therefore cannot be only military balancing. It must also be better regional public goods also. So that is a proper GS2 conclusion. So you have to write an answer as far as GS2 is concerned. So this is in this question, why infrastructure is equals to geopolitics. Then answer is better regional public goods rather than military. Then moving to chapter number 4, that is what actually separated candidates, not the three hardest questions, five recurring tests. Then now what we analyzed all 20 questions, we can identify real separators, and I would not reduce this to three hardest questions. I see five different separator types in this paper. The separator one is the update test. The question number 11, you could know Article 200 extremely well and still write an outdated answer. UPSC tested not just whether you studied constitutional law, but whether you note reflected the operative legal position. The same logic applies also to question number 4. So the first lesson is what? Every contemporary judgment in polity needs a date and a status, not just the Supreme Court held, but when. When held, is it still operative position? Was it reviewed, referred, stayed, clarified, or superseded? So in this detail, with these details only you can have good marks. Then comes to what? Next separator what? The demand count test. This is important. Question number 4, question number 11, question number 13, question number 15. These punish candidates who began writing before decomposing the stem. A beautifully written answer to two-thirds of a question is still an incomplete answer. Before writing, underline demand 1, underline demand 2, underline demand 3. Then you assign the words like 50, 50, 50, etc. This paper made word budgeting part of subject knowledge. Then comes to separator 3, what? The qualifier test. The question 5, adequate qualifier. Then question 13, how far? Question 15, what extent? Question 18, primarily. So look at the words. You have to identify and you have to write answer according to that only. These words determine the thesis. Ignoring them produce generic answers. The smallest word in the question can control the entire answer. Then separator for what? The proposition test. Question 7 says malnutrition is more than health. Question 9 says IPMDA bridges two strategic visions. Question number 10 says what? BRICS is a counterweight. Then question number 16 what? Redefines the purpose of transparency. Question number 19 calls the diaspora a living bridge. Question number 20 says BRI transformed the strategic geography of South Asia. So do not read quotation as decoration. I already told you in our previous marathon and answer writing session. Do not read the quotation as decoration. The quotation is the object of examination. That is why examiner given in that particular question the word. Otherwise, he will not give. A high quality candidate asks, what is this proposition true? Proposition true? Why? To what agree? Where does it fail? So this is the proposition test is important. Then comes to false binary test. The question number 8, generalist versus specialist. Question number 18, welfare versus strategic investment. So UPSC sometimes gives you two poles, not because one is completely right and other completely wrong, but because it wants you to establish the relationship between them. The mature candidate does not mechanically write balanced approach is needed. Balance approach is needed. That phrase means nothing unless you specify the balance. The candidate creates a hierarchy, a division of function or conditions under which each becomes valid. So then, what is the chapter number 5? What GS2 2026 was really testing? That is structured judgment anchored in institutions, not personal opinions. Was this simply a position taking paper? Partly, but I would phrase the finding more precisely. This paper tested structured judgment anchored in institutions. UPSC was not asking for personal opinions. It wanted positions supported by articles, judgments, constitutional design, institutional incentives, governance mechanisms, international architecture. That is a very different from merely knowing facts. And it explains why so many questions were built as propositions. A proposition forces you to do something with your knowledge, not just recall it. This is not a right what you know paper. It is a what use what you know to reach and defend or defend. Use what you know. Use what you know to reach and defend a judgment paper. That distinction should change preparation. So chapter number 6, what changed from 2013 to 2025 questions? Then 2026, UPSC did not abandon the old themes. It upgraded their treatment. Before I audit our own preparation, there is a one comparison we need to make, because otherwise we can say 2026 was different. But different from what? When you place this paper beside the 2013 to 2025 GS2 questions, the answer becomes precise. And most important finding is this: UPSC 2026 did not abandon the old themes. It upgraded their treatment, like women, speaker, election commission, constitutional commissions, tribal development, malnutrition, civil services, governor, federalism, pressure groups, transparency, education, diaspora, China and South Asia. So most of these have clear ancestors in earlier papers. Once you look into it. Earlier UPSC papers already contain analytical questions. They already used how far, to what extent, do you agree, critically evaluate. They already asked candidates to assess institutions and defend propositions. So the defensible conclusion is not that analytical questions was intended or invented in 2026. So the defensible questions, so they already asked candidates to assess institutions and defend propositions. So the defensible conclusion is not that analytical questioning was invented in 2026. 2026 represents an intensification and maturation of a trend that had been developing for years. UPSC made structured judgment that the dominant organizing principle of the paper. Let me show you what changed one axis at a time. The change number one, from recurring themes to recombined themes. Recombined themes. Like take social justice, women vulnerable sections, health, education, poverty, and malnutrition had all been tested before, but each as a separate theme. So 2026 did not discover these themes. It recombined them at a higher analytical level. Question number 7 is the clearest example. Earlier papers separately examined food availability, poverty and hunger, gender and malnutrition, and the poverty, malnutrition, human capital cycle. In 2026, UPSC compresses those strands into one proposition, like malnutrition as a health, then social plus social equity plus human development plus welfare governance. That is not merely another malnutrition question. It is almost a synthesis question built from a decade of PYQs. The evolution is single sector problem to intersector linkage, then systems problem. This is recombined themes. Then the second question change to, that is from scheme performance to conditions for rights. Older welfare questions repeatedly asked whether schemes were effective, whether beneficiaries were aware, whether implementation was weak. But comes to question number 7 in 2026 goes one level deeper. It asks whether rights based welfare can be realized, under non-integrated governance plus minimal public investment. So the object of analysis is no longer one scheme. The object is the state capacity required to convert a constitutional entitlement into a real outcome. The chain is what? Right, then fiscal capacity, then administrative integration, then delivery capability, and then substantive outcome. Earlier UPSC often asked whether welfare schemes worked. In 2026 it asked what institutional conditions must exist for welfare rights to work at all. Then comes to change 3, from institutional description to institutional capacity. The older corpus repeatedly tested commissions and in constitutional bodies, their powers, their limitations, what they could enforce. In question number 5 in 2026 sharpens that line of inquiry. It asks whether NCSC and NCST possess adequate enforcement powers to secure substantive social equality. Now the candidate must distinguish constitutional status from investigative authority, from recommendatory authority, from actual enforcement capacity, from social outcome. So the movement is what? Institution, then mechanism, then outcome. The question is increasingly not what does this institution do, but it is designed capable of producing the constitutional outcome from for which it exists. So the description to outcome. Then comes to fourth one, change for what? From broad polity themes to interacting institutions. Let's take the speaker question. Earlier papers separately examined anti-defection, the declining role of MPs, and the neutrality of the speaker. But in question number 3 in 2026 fuses these concerns. It asks whether the speaker's office has become vulnerable to partisan politics under the current anti-defection regime. This is systems analysis. Institutional design A affects incentives inside institution B under political condition C. So the candidate must diagnose the mechanism, then redesign it. So federalism moved the same way. Question 13 asks you to combine success in accommodating diversity, asymmetric federalism, and dispute resolution perform in a single answer. The pattern is what has the system worked, then by what constitutional mechanism, then where is the friction, then how should it be prepared, then comes to change number 5, that is precision under compression, from general legal knowledge to precision under compression. So question 4 is perfect example, the election commission, the right to vote, electoral roll revision. None of this is a new topic, but UPSC combines status of the voting right plus ECI's role revision authority plus limits of citizenship scrutiny inside 150 votes. So difficulty comes not from obscurity, it comes from the legal distinction and plus demand count plus word allocation. More marks are being decided by distinction inside familiar topics rather than by obscure knowledge. Then change number 6 what? From policy discussion to normative criteria. Question 6 does not merely ask you to list tribal schemes or constitutional safeguards. It asks whether policy is socially grounded and equity based. Those phrases are evaluation criteria. The candidate has to define what good tribal governance should look like and then test actual institutions against that standard. Education moved the same way. Question 18 converts the whole debate into a normative choice. Welfare obligation or strategic investment, and which should be primary. So 2026 repeatedly asks candidates not merely to identify competing objectives but to rank, reconcile, or condition them. Changes 7 what? From pressure group, from pressure to group description to pressure groups to description to democratic theory. This may be clearest intellectual progression in the paper. Earlier UPSC asked about the structure and functioning of pressure groups, formal and informal groups, farmers organizations, business associations, influencing policy, etc. But question number 15 turns the same syllabus phrase into pluralism versus capture. When do organized interests widen representation? When does unequal wealth convert influence into capture? When does access threaten institutional autonomy? So that is no longer a descriptive pressure group answer. So it is political theory applied to Indian governance, and the candidates need a criteria. Influence is normal in democracy, capture is not. Then eighth one is what? Purpose of governance change from governance instruments to purpose of governance. Earlier governance questions frequently revolved around citizen charter, C governance, ICT, DBT, transparency, accountability, implementation, and instruments, etc. But question number 16 asks what? Something more about foundational instruments to institutional purpose. So why do transparency and accountability matter beyond corruption control? Because they contribute to rule of law plus participation plus legitimacy plus trust. So the movement is what? Instrument effectiveness, then institutional purpose, then change number 9 what? Power architecture, from IR event recall to power architecture. The older IR corpus was already analytical, so I would not exaggerate the novelty, but the 2026 quarter is unusually architecture heavy. IPMDA asks how an operational maritime initiative connects Sagar and the Quad. BRICS asks you to distinguish a counterweight from an alternative. Diaspora asks how cultural, economic, and knowledge networks can become geopolitical leverage. BRI asks how infrastructure becomes strategic power and reshapes South Asia. The common question is what? How do structures generate power? That is more useful than memorizing a country by country current affairs diary. The summary of the shift what? if I compress the comparison, this is what happened. The themes stayed familiar. The treatment became more demanding. More specifically, what? Topic to proposition, sector to system, institution to capacity, fact to distinction, discussion to judgment, current event to institutional architecture, balance to hierarchy. And one final progression captures the entire paper is what? Across the years, UPSC has increasingly moved from asking what is it to how is it performing to why is it failing to what does it mean institutionally. And finally, what judgment can you defend about it? And finally, what judgment can you defend about it? That is the real story of GS to 2026, and it gives a much stronger basis for your evaluating our own preparation. Because now the question is not merely did we teach the topic, the question is did we prepare the students for this deeper treatment for the topic. The chapter number 7, now and only now, the Metis audit. Now we can ask the second question: did our own preparation equip a candidate to answer this paper? And I'm not going to do this the easy way. The easy way is to put 20 green ticks on the screen and say we covered everything. That is not an audit, that is marketing. Because an analysis is which all 20 questions were supposedly predicted is not an analysis at all. So we are going to use a harder standard, and I want you to told us to it. We separate three categories. Category number one, content coverage. Was the relevant article judgment, institutional case, policy or IR, architecture present in our material? Then category 2, answer coverage. Did our method teach the student to answer this proposition? These are not the same thing. Having a chapter of federalism does not automatically mean question number 13 was asked. Having BRICS notes does not automatically mean that student knew to have to the count test counterweight versus alternative. Then genuine gap was an important initiative legal update or team simply absent, it was say so plainly. So the real test for every single question is this: could a student who revised only the Metis segment actually construct the answer UPSC demanded? The architecture we have just spent this whole video explaining. Now, did we mention the topic? Could they build the answer? Could they build the answer? So, could they build the answer on the standard? Here is our honest verdict. So, strong coverage in these areas. Student who revised our segment could construct the answer UPSC wanted. Majorly all in more or less about 10 questions. Then comes to partial coverage. Then genuine gaps. Genuine gaps, BRI, genuine gap, BRI. In this, more or less all are covered under strong coverage or otherwise partial coverage from first question to 20 question. Major genuine was genuine gap was BRI. BRI. Then event under a structure what? A Supreme Court judgment. IR did not drop current affairs. It rewarded architecture over event recall. So a Supreme Court judgment, IR development, the current affairs becomes usable and retrieval in the exam hall. So current affairs are also needed, but at the same time static with the current events. So then comes to future one, 2026, 2027 question. Five instructions for GS to 2027. What if you are writing this paper next year? These are the five things I would carry from 2026. The first one is open with judgment. When the question demands one, if the stem says how far, to what extent, adequate, should, can, has become, your introduction cannot hide behind a definition. Answer the question, then defend it. Then second one, count demands before writing. That is most important thing. Word count. Do not discover the third demand at word 2020 220 before writing. Make every demand estimate space, then begin. In a 150 word answer with three demands, discipline matters more than decoration. So then third one, identify the control word. Every question has a word that determines the answer. Question number 5, adequate. Question number 9, bridges. Question number 13, how far. Question number 18, primarily. Question number 19, transforming. Question number 20, transformed. Then circle it. Then moving the fourth one, that is date your constitutional current affairs. A constitutional note is not finished when you write it. It is finished when you verify that it is still legally current. Judgment change, reference happen, larger benches intervene, legislation changes, rules are notified. So remember the transgender amendment presidential assent came at the end of March 2026, but the provision only came into force on 25th May 2026 by a separate commencement notification. Assent is not commencement. The operative date is on operative date is the one that governs the answer. For GS2, the last month before mains needs a legal verification pass, not merely another reading pass. So the fifth one is what? Prepare architectures, not headlines. For every current affairs development, ask what article does this attach to, what institution, what doctrine, what governance failure, what international structure, and what syllabus phrase. If you cannot answer that, the current affair is still only news. And news is difficult to retrieve in an examination hall. Architecture is retrievable. So if you write this paper to 2027, what you have to carry? Open with a judgment. When the stem says how far, adequate, should, can, answer the answer. So open with a judgment and then defend. Then second one, count demands before writing. Mark every demand, estimate space, and then begin. Then identify the control word, then circle it. That word is where the marks hide. Then fourth one is what? Date your constitutional current affairs. Assent is not commencement. The operative date governs the answer. Then comes to fifth one, what? Prepare architecture, not headlines. Attach every event to an article, institution, doctrine, or structure. So open with the judgment, count demands before writing, identify the control word, date your constitutional current affairs, prepare architectures, not headline. So what was GS2 2026? Not an impossible obscure paper, not a pure current affairs paper, not a static paper, and not simply a write your opinion paper. It was a paper that repeatedly took familiar content and asked, can you make a constitutional, institutional, or strategic judgment with it? That is the shift. And the historical comparison makes one thing clear here. UPSC has not made the syllabus unpredictable, it has made superficial preparation increasingly inadequate. So there is no use of superficial preparation. In-depth preparation is needed. And if there is no if, and if there is one line I would carry into preparation for 2026, it is this: do not prepare only to know the topic, prepare to take a defensible position on the topic. Because knowing the speaker was not enough, you had to judge whether the office had become institutionally vulnerable. Knowing the election commission was not enough, you had to distinguish electoral scrutiny from final citizenship determination. Knowing federalism was not enough, you had to judge how far it had accommodated diversity. Knowing education was not enough, You had to decide what should be primary. Knowing the BRI was not enough. You had to explain how infrastructure became geopolitical power. This is what this paper tested. And only after understanding that should any institution, including ours, talk about it covered and what it is missed. So that is GS2 mains 2026, not 20 topics, 20 tests of whether you could turn a knowledge into judgment. And thank you.